I love using my large room lecture voice. Um, don't get to do that much in DTLT anymore. So these are the events coming up. Today we're talking about the digital liberal arts and sciences. I'm just going to say a few words to get us started, and then we'll open it up to our panel discussion, and we'll have opportunities for everyone to chime in later. Do note, as we start here, there's a Twitter hashtag, DOOO. I believe it's case insensitive on the Twitter search, but if you'd like to follow along or participate in some discussion in a back channel, you can do so. And we'll leave this up here so you can see the Twitter handles for our participants in case you want to quote them or sling some digital happy hands or something at them during the discussion. Okay. A few years ago, massive open online courses, or MOOCs, became big news. Since then, they've had a big impact on higher education. I don't mean that we're all teaching MOOCs, because we're not. But the questions that MOOCs and online education in general has raised about what good teaching looks like online has revitalized questions about what good teaching looks like in general. I can certainly say that in my field of music theory, pedagogy has become a credible area of research once again in a way that it hasn't for some time. While MOOCs are becoming less of a buzzword and look less like our future, the questions of pedagogy, both digital and analog, have remained. The role of digital technology in education, especially the internet, has had another profound effect. By allowing us to easily peer into each other's professional worlds, or at least a little corner of it, the web has made it easier to have conversations about our teaching craft outside our departments, our institutions, our disciplines, and the slow pace of academic journal publication. As I mentioned in my blog post announcing this town hall, the most influential people in my first years of teaching were generally outside my institution and outside my field. Some were even outside higher ed. These themes are where we draw our focus for today. How does the digital impact our teaching in a liberal arts university? And how can the digital re-energize our cross-disciplinary relationships as we work together to help our students be transformative agents in an increasingly digital world? So with that theme of cross-disciplinary digital pedagogy in mind, we've assembled a panel of faculty from a variety of disciplines to discuss these important issues. So just raise your hand as I say your name. I'm going to go down in order here, which isn't necessarily seating order, but we have Mindy Urchal from Psychological Sciences, Janine Davis from Education, Elizabeth Johnson-Young from Communication, Andy Livy-Smith from Historic Preservation, Alan Griffith from Biology, and Kelly Slunt from Chemistry. So let's dive into our discussion, especially since we're a little behind schedule here. When we talk about the digital liberal arts and how that might impact arts, humanities, sciences, first I think we should talk about what the liberal arts are in general. So panel, what are the liberal arts? Or as Jesse wrote, what is the liberal arts? Is it are? Is it a set of disciplines? General education courses, a frame of mind for all disciplines, or an idea that seeks to break down disciplinary boundaries? What do y'all think? I gave him these questions in advance.
I definitely think of, are these actually picking us up? Do we need to pull, okay.
Yes, you might want to slide it.
Slide them back.
Closer, yeah.
I definitely think of the liberal arts as a way of thinking rather than a particular course or discipline or set of disciplines, because a liberal arts education is a way of educating students to think broadly about ideas and build skills that can be used in a variety of areas, disciplines, jobs that they might engage with in their futures. So I don't think of it as being tied to any one specific thing, more about general ideas.
I think one thing I would add to that, so I agree with everything. As I was thinking about this question, I was thinking about the difference between maybe a liberal education and a technical education, right? And so because we call ourselves liberal arts, we, not always, but oftentimes shy away from teaching certain kinds of courses. It even spills over to the sciences. We do not have very, very applied kinds of courses like laboratory science education. We don't do things like that at Mary Washington. And we've chosen not to do that because it doesn't really fit into this idea of liberal arts and sciences.
Counterpoint? I would say that my field here, the way it's taught here, is actually very practice-oriented. But I think my field in itself is kind of a microcosm of the liberal arts approach because it's so interdisciplinary. Because you can't do preservation without knowing something about history, something about chemistry, something about social science, like psychology, about economics, about everything. And so I think a lot of it is about how to, and I hate using buzzwords, but it's a lot about how to synthesize all this stuff into something that makes sense. And I think that's what the liberal arts approach can do, is that it can teach students to take all these disparate views and kind of bring them together in a way that makes them better at their job and just better at being people.
Yeah, I would agree, especially the whole interdisciplinary nature of the liberal arts and finding connections, trying to even just make connections between the individual disciplines and things.
I was gonna just agree and say that, yeah, I think it's a mindset. It's also I think it's also it's action too, right? That you maybe have a focus, but you also have a broader range of abilities to think critically through other classes that you've taken and, other experiences that you can relate back to your own discipline by being more like transdisciplinary, I guess.
Yeah, so following up on this, I'm hearing an idea that the more interdisciplinary fields are more applied, at least just from the small sample we have here. Is that really the case? And if so, is it because the liberal education idea of synthesis is more embedded in it? I don't know.
I don't think I can generalize to other fields. I know that preservation often has to justify its existence because it's not an old field, and therefore being able to say, hey, you'll get a job is an important part of what we do, because otherwise, kind of what's the point? What are we adding? But I don't know that that's true of all fields.
Yeah, I also think it comes down to how you define applied or how you think of applied. Because within psychology, learning how to do research, read research, analyze data, those are applied skills. And those are skills that have gotten our students jobs right out of undergrad. They're not psychologists, but those are useful applied skills. That said, those are just tools that fit within the larger way of approaching ideas as a psychologist or using psychological theory. So there can be applied skills that are part of lots of disciplines, whether they're more traditionally interdisciplinary or more traditionally have a distinct academic identity.
I want to follow up just a little bit more. I like this. This is a nice discussion. We've got other questions we'll get to, but this idea of applied skills as being things, I think everyone who's mentioned applied skills has mentioned applying them in something other than like a narrow professional route, right? And that seems to be the thing that sets liberal arts apart from a professional school. I most recently came from a college of music, and it's there the balance between humanities and arts, professional and liberal is very fraught. It's a question we wrestle with, but it seems like the idea of applying skills in ways that synthesize it, reach outside the home discipline are a core part of liberal education. That seems to be what I'm hearing. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think liberal arts is more about teaching people to have a broad array of tools that they can use and different approaches that they become familiar with, as opposed to one specific specialized thing that they are becoming more expert in. That's not typically part of the liberal arts.
Yeah, and sort of maybe adding to that, it's sort of a stance or a mindset that there is value in other fields outside of your own. That there is a lot to learn within your field, but also a lot to learn with outside of your field, and that you have to draw on that to solve problems sort of in unexpected or new ways sometimes.
I think that it kind of takes that trite, learning to fish thing, but taking it one step further up. You're not teaching students to fish. You're teaching students to learn themselves how to figure out how to fish. And by learning out how to, I know, I'm sorry, but by learning, I know, super meta, I apologize. But by learning how to fish, they can also learn how to, I don't know, fix their plumbing, or think about world peace, or, you know, any of those things, because fundamentally, learning how to learn is the point.
I think also some of it may be a communication issue, because I mean, for example, as a chemist in a very technical environment, you would focus on using very specific terminology and things that only maybe a chemist would learn. But I think chemists within the liberal arts learn that you have to sometimes communicate about science to a non-scientist, and you learn those skills to be able to do that, which might help in policy development later, or interacting with someone who doesn't understand what chemical terms mean.
So I don't know if this is think about this in a slightly different way, but I think we all know and understand that the skills and the knowledge that we teach at this institution can be applied to just an enormous number of different career paths that students might take after they leave here. And we know that. I think one of our fundamental challenges is having students understand that and apply that. And maybe the way to get that done is to do interdisciplinary stuff, right? One of the most difficult things that psychologists and brain scientists understand students to do is applying what you learn in one area or discipline to someplace else. It is very difficult for people to do that. And maybe the way to drive it is through interdisciplinarity. Then they can actually see how you can use one skill that you learned here someplace else.
Right, so we're going to come back more and talk about how we can learn from other disciplines and open those lines of communication towards the end. Before we get there, I want to move on to the next question. How does the digital, in particular, but not necessarily entirely the internet, impact or transform or even redefine the work that we do? And I'm thinking, let's talk about this generally. We're scholars, we're teachers, we're also students, and we're thinking about what we want our students to do. So our work in the academy, how is it impacted by the digital, by the internet?
To make collaboration and discussions out within, you know, your own kind of disciplinary community, and also outside your disciplinary community, a lot easier, and a lot more, in some senses, a lot more productive.
One benefit that I've seen, which is a double-edged sword, is that you can reduce the intimidation factor, I think, for a lot of this stuff. So, for instance, Twitter is a great example for me, because I'm an avid Twitter user, and I don't separate my personal life from my professional life. And when I was an undergrad, my professors were like statues or something. Like they didn't exist outside the classroom at all, as far as I knew. They were these old, you know, experienced people, and I had no idea how I would get there. And to my students, I've never been that, because they see me and pictures of my kids and like me using swear words and other things, not in the classroom because that's inappropriate, but on Twitter, where I'm myself, right? I'm not going to censor myself. And that, I think that actually makes them feel like they know me, and therefore they feel less intimidated and less like they can't relate to me and they can't relate to what I'm teaching. And I realize, again, that's a double-edged sword, because of course it also means that you have to create that boundary between being a faculty member and being a friend. But I think it does allow for this dialogue and this sense of belonging outside the classroom.
And you might think that you're having a class discussion, and the students who are most quiet in the classroom, you wouldn't think that they would then feel comfortable on Twitter, but I think often that does happen, where they can't get a word in edgewise face to face, but as soon as you remove that sort of affective filter and you're in another setting, even though it's a worldwide, anyone who wants to could see it, I think they just haven't come to see it that way. They don't have the same fear when they're typing as they do when they're speaking.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I had something that I think is another double-edged sword. So in the, I keep thinking about this in the scientists. I don't see a lot of communication among scientists, and I may be, notice I'm the only person up there that does not have a Twitter account that I think does have meaning.
Do you have a domain of your own?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
See, I don't have that yet. I haven't found the time.
So I don't see a lot of direct communication and discussion among scientists. Maybe I just don't have the right colleagues that do that kind of thing. But the availability of information, just compared to so you may recall searching through indexes. How many people can remember? So that's the way I got information and found references. And it's so much easier to get information and get your hands on PDFs of full text. This other side of the sword is that we lose control of what students can get at that they at least think may be answering the kinds of questions that we want them to be answering. And so they get all the trash much more easily along with all the good information.
Yeah, to jump off of that, because I was actually going to bring up the same idea that information is a lot more accessible thanks to the digital, but you get both good and bad information there. But part of it can also be information overload. So much information's available. I was just teaching my research method students about using PsycInfo. So I throw in a search term that I knew wouldn't give me hundreds of thousands of hits, and it still gave me like 15,000. And they were like, oh my God. How do you even begin? Like, you just can't study that topic. Well, of course you can, and they're just overwhelmed. Or if they can't find something on page 1 of Google Scholar results, they tell me it doesn't exist, right? Because they're used to information being so readily accessible. Sometimes they haven't learned the deep dive skills that those of us who remember card catalogs and other reference books that we had to dig through to get to the material, the primary source material we needed, might have developed along the way, because those first things you tried didn't work, and we didn't have Google yet, so we weren't used to that type of search. So I think for those of us who started our academic training before all of these digital resources became available, the ways we learn to do things are so different from the ways our students are learning to do things, because the resources available are different. It's sometimes hard to realize what their struggles are, because they are different than what our struggles might have been as students.
Right, and I think that in addition to the whole filtering and curation issues, which are really challenging, I think, if you don't know how to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, it can be very tough. But from my perspective as a preservationist, a really tough part of the digital revolution is trying to convince students that drawing by hand is worthwhile. Cursive is worthwhile. And it's tough to do. It's tough to explain those things and to explain, if you don't know how to draw pencil to paper, you will not be able to draw well digitally. And it's very, very hard to convince them that that's the case, because they did not grow up with that analog point of view.
It's true. In psych, it's why should I have to calculate an ANOVA by hand when I can have SPS do it in 30 seconds? And it's, because that will help you understand why you're doing this and what's going
learning to
on.
drive a stick shift car before learning to drive a regular
Exactly.
car. That's always my this is why we're
Exactly.
going to calculate a correlation.
Yeah, they
by
don't know
hand.
how to drive a stick
Shift car.
What's this?
Admittedly, I don't know. how
A
to drive
standard. It's a standard.
I don't know. That's a really good example for my part.
I'm thinking there's going to be an article coming out here soon in hybrid pedagogy called Stick Shift Pedagogy. Or something like that.
I love it.
Yeah. So, let's keep this. This is good stuff. We're going. It seems like there's a lot of commonalities between the disciplines here. We're going to come back to that later if we have time. But let's actually dive into what are some of the differences between the arts, the sciences, and the humanities when it comes to pedagogy. And I want to open this up to kind of everyone here to participate a little bit. What kind of differences do you know, or maybe assume, or wonder if exist between the arts, the sciences, the humanities? What differences exist between the way we teach the arts, the way we teach the sciences, the way we teach the humanities? Or what differences do you assume or wonder might possibly exist? Just so you don't get in trouble by saying it's there. Like you could say, I wonder if anyone else has dealt with this before.
I wonder if one thing when Alan was talking, he mentioned something about mentioned something about teaching a technical science that caught my attention, and it'd be great if you could revisit that. If you remember it better than I do, I can't remember your words. But one thing that I would like to ask this entire crew, the first question you asked, what is a liberal arts education? Does that mean something completely different to hard science versus hard humanities, if you can say that? I kind of see in the hard science, we're teaching at a liberal arts institute, so it's like, well, you have to diversify and pull art into your class and pull humanities into your classroom. Don't just teach these facts and technical skills. Is it the same for an artist? Are they saying you have to pull chemistry into your class? You have to pull biology into your class? I don't see that reciprocity. But am I feeling attacked? But maybe I totally changed the tone of your question, and I apologize.
I'll just throw in that as a music theory professor, I've had many students who went into music to avoid math. Some of them were brilliant at it, but there were quite a few who I don't want to do that. I'm going to go the art route, and then they get to understanding what is underneath the music that they love. And I tell them, when you become a music major, you forfeit the right for music to be mystical to you. You make that experience for others, but now you got to know how it works. And there's a lot of math, there's cognitive science, and literature, language, there's a lot of stuff in there. And there's sometimes and sometimes resistance. But is that the reciprocity you're thinking of?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
I mean, I started out as an architectural historian. That was what my undergraduate degree was in. And then I ended up doing my doctorate on statistical analysis of pedestrian activity, which involved a lot of negative binomial regression models. So, is there such a thing as a pure discipline? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not going to ask that question.
Raise
I
your
take it
hands
back.
if you belong to a pure discipline.
Nah.
You're an applied mathematician. That's not pure. Okay, you're not, okay.
Thank you.
In response to Parrish's comment, I think there's certainly more in a liberal arts education of what you're talking about than there would be perhaps in other kinds of colleges and universities. So if you're in art history, yeah, you're going to talk about some science related to, preserving art or whatever it might be. I was just reading I had an occasion to read about an English professor today, and I was interested in how that person was doing content analysis that one might do in sociology. Not of a novel necessarily, of newspaper articles about a particular topic. And I was struck by exactly what you're saying, that I think we have many opportunities to do exactly that. And maybe the reciprocity isn't as obvious in the other direction, but I certainly think it's there.
Yeah, and the thing I would say is that at a number of the larger institutions that I've been at, the issue of whether my work counted or not was constantly under question and under scrutiny. And so doing work in digital technology and sort of thinking about, I'm not writing about the great American novel, I'm writing about the great American website. And having that be sort of questioned about whether or not that was a legitimate discipline is something that I really encountered. I actually haven't had a person here that I've talk to look at me quizzically about my work. There's been a bit of an understanding that those kind of crossovers are welcomed.
And so I would just add, and maybe there are other kinds of crossovers that we should be, if in fact you're feeling attacked. Parrish. So maybe 2 years ago now, there was another panel discussion, and it actually was students that had done creative work and research from across the university. And so as they were talking to, probably it was a physicist or somebody in the sciences, and how they muddled their way through learning new technique to get to result. And then there was I think it actually was a musician that talked about muddling their way through learning the technology that they were using to create their creative work. It really struck me, oh my God, that is so much the same process in this art and the sciences and we should be looking for those things so we help students understand those kinds of deep similarities between really different disciplines.
I haven't heard a whole lot of really clear differences between how we teach the disciplines. Are there some? Can we tease some out?
I mean,
No.
so, all right, I'll jump in and
Oh,
give
thanks.
one, which is that my field has to be in the field. It has to be face to face. It has to be in the field. You have to go to a dank basement and crawl around. You have to go to a city meeting and listen to the crazies. You have to go into an attic and fear of heights and carpenter bees, and you have to do all of those things, or you can't really do preservation. And I think some other disciplines, you can do them from anywhere. But that's not true. That's not true of everything. And I think that's definitely a limiting factor, that whenever I see the proposals, for instance, for digital classes, like purely digital classes, and I'm like, that sounds great, but I can't. Not in my field, not ever.
And I think the sciences are the same way. I mean, we
No.
can't divorce the laboratory, and there's no real substitution. They attempt to do substituted digital labs, but there's nothing. You can't learn really chemistry, like especially I just came from organic chemistry lab. The students actually have to be in there, and as they say, their experiment failed, but they actually have to experience that and see it, and you can't do that through pen and paper or a digital computer screen.
Yeah, that's the same with psych. Our lab is tied to our research methods course, and we teach a lot of courses off and on in summer sessions where they're compact. We can teach our stat courses in the summer, and that works for some students and is a horribly bad idea for other students. But we have never taught our research methods class in the summer, and we never will, because you really can't do the research project that is the core of doing that class in that short semester, even if you do the longer version of a summer session, because you can't have them do a data-driven project because they don't have enough time to get through IRB to collect data. That all takes time, plus teaching them the content. So while there are schools that do things like that, they just don't have students collect data. And we see that as a key piece of that class, that they need to actually get into their data that's messy and that you don't know what will happen because they're used to working with data sets that we prepare and give them. We know what's going to happen, good or bad. And then they get real data and they're like, what happened? And I go, I don't know because I didn't make this up. Let's try to figure it out. And that those problems they encounter that come from real people giving you real data is critical. And so, yeah, there are just some things you can't do other ways. I could teach social psych online. I don't want to, but I could. But I can't teach research methods online and have it be give it that same component unless I found some way to get people through the research process completely physically removed from me.
I also think we would need to make a distinction between teaching online and the ways that digital tools have affected our disciplines, right? That those are related, but they're not the same thing. So if you take a field like history, where public history has always been a thing, but the digital realm has completely transformed the ability of professional historians, but also for undergraduate students to become professional historians, to reach out, to create things that others can use. So it is there's no question in my mind that these digital tools have transformed the undergraduate teaching. They've transformed scholarly communication. They've transformed the ability of historians to reach out to a broader public and to their colleagues in ways that haven't existed before. The other thing is that as a social historian, the tools that other disciplines have developed, right, to do text mining, to do statistical analysis, to do any number of things. You know, there are people who are doing mass studies of say, the census in 1860, 1870, 1880, and 1890, but they were hand entering those things in on pieces of, like, sort of collecting pieces of paper and then hand creating those, right? So we are able to do a kind of level of analysis and to ask questions that that we've asked before but haven't been able to answer, or not able to answer in a finite amount of time. You know, history is a discipline that's been fundamentally transformed, I think, by digital tools and by communication tools.
To jump off that, when I was thinking about this question, you know, I don't really know what the differences are between disciplines, right? I had a liberal arts education. I am a psych gender studies person. I was trained in both. My psych area is inherently interdisciplinary within the field of psychology, which might sound weird, but psychology is not really one discipline. It's like 40 disciplines all linked. So mine is like overlapping a whole bunch of different ones. So I get that there's differences, but I've only ever worked in mine. So my knowledge of how other disciplines work is really as an outsider, as an outside observer. So when I thought about this, one of the things that occurred to me was that some disciplines outside of the classroom, right, when you think of the discipline as a whole, seem to have embraced the digital as a larger part of them. And history definitely came to mind for me. And part of that might be because I know Jeff and I know what Jeff has done. And so that came to mind as a good exemplar. Sorry, I'm a psychologist. But psychology uses digital tools. We collect data online. We analyze data both online and through other digital tools. We do searches. We share information. We definitely talk online. But as far as changing our discipline in some way, other than making some things go faster or be more accessible, I don't think technology has really radically shifted the discipline. The tools we use might be different. The speed with which we can do analyses might be different. But it hasn't really changed that much. I was talking with my students today that when I was in research methods 20-ish years ago, I was doing SPSS analyses where SPSS was on a mainframe. And they had no idea what that was. And I had to explain that you ran an analysis and it printed out in another building, and then you walked over, and then you got an error message, and then you had to go back.
Just do a Google image search.
That's
what it looks
that's
like.
A change of the discipline.
Exactly.
I think
so,
we sort of...
So we have speed has been the change, right? So things happen faster. We expect things to happen faster. We have greater access to people. Our sample sizes have increased. So our discipline expectations have changed. But as far as what we're teaching and how we're teaching it, it hasn't really changed because the jobs people are doing haven't really changed that much yet. And I don't think my discipline has figured out how to integrate some of these things that other disciplines have found ways to integrate. Like, I just don't think we think of them as part of us in the same way yet.
One thing that we have in education that's very similar to what you're saying is this idea that they have to go out and do it, right? You have to, if you're learning to be a teacher, you're gonna have to observe teaching and practice doing it and so on. And I do get to see, and you know, there are upper level classes where there are math majors there are English majors, there are history majors, there are art majors, there are theater majors. So I do kind of hear from them sort of what they expect about how teachers can and should teach. And you know, it's really hard, I think, for some of the history people. They really love lecturing so hard. So, you know, we sort of challenge each other a little bit and sort of like, you know, here's something they do in art that can inform what you do in history or science. But one of the ways, I mean, I do it on Twitter, but they see schools in this area, which is actually not very much like where some of them may want to live someday. You know, one of them now is living in Japan teaching English. So, one way that there are teachers all across the world sort of opening this window into their classrooms, that's how that's one way I like to like expand the practice so that they can see, you know, what you see in this classroom here in Fredericksburg. It doesn't look like that in as close as Charlottesville. It doesn't look like that in California. It sure doesn't look like that in Finland or, you know, wherever else. So I see that as a huge change, a huge opportunity to kind of level the playing field so that they know teaching looks different in different places.
So let me just throw out a possibility of just see if people agree or disagree with this as a difference between the humanities and the scientists in terms of our use of tools, digital tools. My impression, and this is a lot from talking to you, Jeff, and talking to other folks, is that humanities folks are more likely to use digital tools as something to mediate conversations amongst people. And I was going to say earlier, and I'll say again, I have no clue how to use a blog in my classes yet that create conversations between my students. But, and this really struck me yesterday when I was talking to Brian in geography, that I use digital tools to get information away from me, to take what I think I've created as knowledge and get it out to as many people as I possibly can. And that's a very different kind of use of technology. Equally important.
I wouldn't say that that's different than what public historians do.
Okay.
I think that's a distinction without a difference.
Okay.
I think this, oh, sorry, one more comment.
Thank you. I'm Jackie from Geography. I don't know what the definition of digital is, right? Is it the internet or is it any technology? If it's any technology, then my discipline in this country has been turned on its head by geospatial information systems, right? GIS, not this university, but other schools have had their geography departments pulled apart and then put back together. Harvard did away with geography during the, I don't know what, lull after the digital revolution and, you know, numbers revolution, quantitative revolution in geography, and then brought it back because they realized how important it is. If you read documentation about the kind of geographer government agencies want to hire, they want a liberal arts trained geographer. They want a GIS technician who is more than a number pusher. They don't want just technicians. They want people with professional ethics and language and culture. They've recently discovered human geography, which is, of course, you know, been around forever. But in Britain and in British Commonwealth countries, geography is enormous. When I was 18, it was the most popular undergraduate major. In this country, people don't know what geography is. They still think it's memorizing countries, right? So I can agree with all of you, right? So I don't know what that does. I don't know what it does to anybody. But yes, it's pulled it apart, and in some places it's pushed it back together, you know, my discipline. But it depends on your definition of digital.
So I'd like to follow up on that, because when we started this conversation, immediately my mind went to GIS. You know, I think that there are a couple fundamental issues that students face today that, to a certain extent, we didn't, because we were raised presumably in an analog life, where the amount of information you could collect was limited, like literally physically limited. And today, students have a much different way of interacting with the world. They use technology all the time. I think very few of them understand how to use it at all, to the point where I've had students not understand Excel at all, how to PDF at all. They don't know what GIF stands for.
How
they
to
don't-
insert a page break
Right,
in
they don't-
Microsoft
No,
Word.
they don't know anything, right? And
basic
it's
skills.
because they don't think of it that way. They think of it as a vehicle for conversation, and it is an amazing vehicle for conversation. But they don't think of the envelope, the format. Whereas I think of that format all the time, right? So communication is easier, but understanding the underlying format of that communication, I think, has become much, much harder. And so we're kind of trying to teach them two different things at once, both the format and the underlying communication. And that's not an easy thing to understand. I think that's actually a really hard thing to understand. So for instance, for geography, yeah, you can understand GIS, and that takes years of learning right there, because Esri's horrible. But on top of that, and much more importantly than that, you have to understand why, right? What's the why? What are we trying to learn? So you're asking students to understand both the technology and, you know, what we're doing with that technology. Not easy at all.
So, it's me.
Hi.
Hi, Martha.
Sorry. Martha Burtis, Digital Knowledge Center. I want to push back a little bit on
Okay,
the
good.
perception of students' use of technology, because I would actually describe the way that they approach technology a little differently. I see students all the time who master incredibly complex things and understand that complexity using technology. The difference is that they do it because they are intrinsically motivated to do it for something that they find really personally important and valuable to them. And I think we talk about, for example, the fact they don't know how to do page breaks. That's because they don't live in a print culture. Page breaks don't mean anything to them. They literally don't understand why that even matters. And I'm shocked by this all the time when I'll bring up things that I don't think I'm that old, and I think I'm pretty savvy, but I'll bring up things that I think they should know, and I realize that this is just outside of their realm of they don't live in that particular world. So I think a lot of the challenge that we face is figuring out how to intrinsically motivate them to care about the things that we know they need to care about for our disciplines, but respect that they absolutely have the ability to master this and can actually do it with very little help once they realize, for example, I cannot for the life of me figure out how Snapchat works. Like, I got no clue about the interface for that app. Every time I go in there, I am completely lost. And if I say that to a student, they look at me like I'm crazy. And that's kind of silly, like, what's the value of Snapchat, except that they've mastered, like, they just played with it and figured it out. So I think we have to figure out how to tap into that a little bit.
So Martha, if I can respond to that, I think that's a really difficult communication issue, and something that is really hard, not just from their perspective, but from our perspective. And I know as a mom, my kid totally does not understand not digital, right? When I told her, well, I didn't have an iPad on car trips when I was a kid, she said, well, but you had an iPhone. And I'm like, no. Mom, I'm sorry you had to use a smaller screen, but fundamentally it's not so bad, right? She doesn't understand. And I try to explain that to her, but to her, as you said, it's totally foreign. My 9-month-old baby knows how to swipe on a phone already. So I understand that. I think it's tough. I think it's particularly challenging to teach some of those old-timey analog skills because students don't deal with them on a day-to-day basis. So for instance, I used to write, and I still do write rough drafts. Right? I'll write an outline for things and then write on it, and my students by default are not going to do that. And teaching them how to do that is particularly hard because that's not the world they grew up in, right? The world they grew up in is you type, right? You don't have to write longhand and then scratch out and then, oh no, now you have an ugly scratch on your page. They don't know what that's like. And it's very hard to try to explain that when they don't have that experience.
Yeah, Shannon Simpson Library. I'm just gonna reiterate what Martha said because, like we were talking about the information overload, I think there are quote unquote tools overload. Like back in the day, you would have Word and Excel. Well, then you could learn those things. Yeah. I feel like I live on a need to know. Like, okay, if I need to figure out how to do this, well, then I'll learn that tool. I was a history major. I do so much work in Excel now. I never touched Excel once as a history major. Yeah. Like there was no reason for me to touch Excel, but I need to do all sorts of spreadsheets at my job. And one of my students today, she's like, "How'd you learn all this?" I was like, Googling. And she laughed, and she saw me later. I had 2 screens up. I Googled how to do this thing. She's like, "You really do Google?" I was like, yes, this is the what you get to out of your experience here. You learn how to find the answers. I'm not an expert in Excel by any means, but the answers are out there. So that's, if you have a good liberal arts education, you can teach yourself how to find the right tool and then how to use that
Learning
tool.
how to learn how to fish.
Yes.
And learning how to learn how to decide between fishing and hunting and farming.
Mapping.
It's just to follow up on that same idea. Yeah, it's like 3 different things. It's knowing how to Google, but also when you Google that this is actually the right page, this is the one that's going to help me, okay? It's knowing if I open up Excel and I futz around with it for a while, I can actually figure that out. And it's having the confidence to know that you can do that. And we started this by talking about how that's what a liberal arts education brings you, right? So it's learning how to fish, it's learning when to know when you should hunt, and it's learning what to do when there is no fish. Right, what are we going to do in the future? Having that confidence to realize that, yes, we can figure that out. I think that, to me, that's always been far more important than, can I do an analysis of variance in SPSS, which is also something that I teach. But it's knowing, when do I need ANOVA and when do I need this other thing? That's the really important question.
So we are getting close to time here. I want to recap a couple ideas, themes that have come up, and then kind of move us into one last question. And I think if we go over a couple minutes, it's okay since we started late. And then we have a reception coming up in which we can talk about this more at length. And of course, Twitter never sleeps, except when it does. So a couple things have come out here. The need for deep dive skills, I really like that phrase, as well as what Howard Rheingold has called crap detection, how to filter through what we see to find out what's good, what we need, how to know when we're operating on a need-to-know basis that is what we need to know, right? I liked Parrish's phrase of the hard humanities. I'm not really sure how that fits in here. That's just, I'm going to put that in my Twitter bio now, I think. But the idea I wrote down, drawing by hand is worthwhile, that idea that there are analog skills that are really important. But I think going along with what Martha and Shannon have said about the need for intrinsic value, we can't assume that our students will follow us into that if we don't show them the value in it. And if we can foster that value, they're capable of some pretty amazing things, even with analog tools. And so I think those are kind of good takeaway points that I've written down. I'm sure you all have some others that are on Twitter. But kind of bringing those back fresh in our mind again, I want to ask our last question. Where there are points of cross-disciplinary contact here, commonalities between our disciplines, how can we take advantage of them to do our work better and to build a stronger community of educators and learners here? So thinking about some of these things that we share in common, those the deep dive skills, the crap detection, the analog and the digital tools, how do we work together to help foster these things or to learn from each other?
So I think part of it is to de-emphasize the specificity of the tool. I have to agree with Shannon on that you can get so lost in the specificity of the tool, and then you become an expert in that tool, and then the developer stops working on that tool, or it goes behind a paywall, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, no. In my own life, I went from using tons and tons of different tools to simplifying, and now I'm back mostly to plain text, because I was so done with the tool overload. And so I think I try to pass that on to my students, that learning the tool is only helpful if the tool is useful to you, right? If it's not a useful tool, don't learn it. Which is why I don't do GIS anymore, because I don't enjoy that tool at all. And so although I know it's important, I also know that, what's that? I can't say it's not useful at all, but I can say that I don't enjoy using it. And so I can, what's the word I'm looking for? Yes, that's the one. I don't have to do it myself anymore. But so I think that, so there's it's useful to become an expert in some tools, but only those tools that are durable, that are useful to you, and that give you a sense of empowerment. Because I think a lot of those things can make you feel like you don't know what you're doing. And that's the worst possible feeling. And I think that can be very alienating and give you that imposter syndrome and it's just bad across the board. And so learning a tool that is useful to you and that makes you feel like you know what you're doing, that's good, I think. That's it. Yeah.
So I think that here at University of Mary Washington, and I do not know if this happens at other institutions, I suspect at institutions of similar size and like, we have, through DTLT, through the Teaching and Learning Center, we have developed a cohort model that brings folks together from across disciplines and across the university to do things like domain of one's own. And I think that is a very useful model, and it's a model that seems to work for us, where we force ourselves together and talk to colleagues from, for me, outside the sciences. And I hope we still keep using that kind of model. We need to continue to figure out how to scale up that model is a really important thing, but that cohort model works.
Agreed.
Can I connect something Andy just said to something that Alan said a long time ago? Just this idea of tools empowering and not using tools, or at least that awful feeling when the tool makes you feel like you don't know what you're doing. I feel like a lot of our pedagogy is making students feel like they don't know what they're doing. Alan, you talked about talking to non-scientists. Was that you, Alan? Or, like talking about science to non-scientists, that's gonna be a big part of your work. Sorry. I've told my music students that a lot. You come to music school, you've been doing this for like a dozen years at least, and you have a lot to offer. And oftentimes the music classes tell you, here's all the stuff you don't know. And it makes you feel constantly like there's some new thing you don't understand, whether it's a tool or just the concept, when they actually have a lot to offer the world outside of professional music students. And I wonder how much that really isn't necessarily a digital analog question, that's just how we teach and how we approach our students. How much of our approach with our digital tools or just our teaching in general is about helping students realize what they have to offer, and then maybe using a tool like Domain of One's Own to share that out and to engage the public with it.
I feel like what we need to do is like have a panel of everything. No, I'm just kidding. And like a whole bunch of design sprints and stuff. I mean, I feel like we are doing some pretty cool stuff here. But I do kind of feel like we're also preaching to the choir a little bit. Like everybody here like kind of believes that this is worthwhile. But there are a lot of people here who maybe, you know, don't know much about it or like sort of don't see the value. So I do think we need to like reach out to those people, sort of continue sharing why it matters, what we can learn from it, how we use it in our own work, and writing about it and that kind of thing, researching about it. I think that would help bring it to a bigger audience.
Can I jump off of something Janine was saying? For however many years DTLT's been around, once a year at least at one of our department meetings, whoever's department chair says, DTLT's asked if we want them to come in and talk with us about anything. And my department, without fail, says no. Like, that's it. Like, there's no discussion. It's just no. And I don't really think it's that my entire department is scared of anything digital or scared of any change, because I truly don't believe that, and I don't think that's reflected in what we do. But I think as a discipline, and therefore as a department, we don't know what to do with DTLT. We don't know what questions to ask. Like, we don't know what to ask you to come in and talk about, because we literally don't know the question to ask, right? And so I think that sometimes that's part of the disconnect. Like, you hear cool things other people are doing, and sometimes you need a guide to help you figure out how to make that link between what someone else is doing and what you might be able to pull from that and use in your own. And that's something we do with our students, trying to get them to think interdisciplinarily. But sometimes we need that help too. And so, you know, the benefit to the cross-disciplinary stuff is I get to hear about things that might be more common in other disciplines that are really rare in mine, and then hear about what is working and isn't working for my colleagues, digital or analog, doesn't matter. But sometimes I'm not sure what to do with that, like how I can make use of that myself. I might think it's cool. And so I think that's one of the places where we don't always perhaps do as much as we need to, and why some departments are probably a little bit more divorced from DTLT than some others that are more integrated.
Right.
And I
and
sort of think, oh, sorry. I sort of think what you do is you hang out with us. You have a glass of wine with us after this. You also come to panels like you are right now. I mean, that's the first thing that you do is just hang out together because we like to talk about the same stuff, or a lot of the same stuff.
All right.
We have a few comfy chairs in the office. You can come and work and just work.
So one of the things that I've been thinking about as we've been talking about this, and part of the reason for this very series is exactly what Jackie was saying, exactly what Alan and I have had conversations about, what Mindy's just articulated about her whole department, is that we don't know what we mean when we say digital, right? And the fact is that we have a pretty inclusive definition in the strategic plan of what digital liberal arts are, in the way that DTLT approaches these questions, the way that DKC approaches these questions. And so part of what we need to do this year is to begin to talk within our units and across units about what does the digital look like in our discipline, what does the digital look like at our institution. It has to be part of the conversation that we have. We're in this odd position where the work that Mary Washington does in the area of digital pedagogy and digital liberal arts is better known at other institutions than it is at its own institution, right? And some of that's on me and on the unit, but some of this is about having these larger conversations. That's part of the reason to have it in this way. The other thing that occurs to me as we think about what everybody's been saying and saying, well, I know my discipline and I don't. Part of the problem we're having is that we're having to convey to students why the things that we do in our discipline matter without fully understanding why the things in our discipline matter. And I mean, if we want to know the people who know all of our disciplines the best, it's the students actually who are in the best position to tell us what's going on. Like, oh, this department gets it, this department doesn't. This department is really engaged with this department doesn't. So one of the things I hope to see over this next year is we bring students into these conversations and to say, and to ask them, but I encourage all of us to ask our students in our classes, what are the things, how are digital tools used, broadly defined, in your other classes, right? Because I think that's a chance for us to answer some of these questions about what's happening, so.
I think examples like that would be helpful too. When I was at NC State, part of what I did was work with campus writing and speaking, and it was geared towards professors, but we would get people from math to lead a workshop on how they use speaking in the classroom, or somebody from biology would lead a workshop, and it was just those specific examples that then people would say, oh, so I can use speaking in my classrooms when it's not a public speaking classroom, right?
And
something similar to that kind of model.
Cool.
So-
Well, oh, sorry. We're one more comment from. Oh.
I would just want to say something quickly because I was commenting to Erin. Erin's sciences reference librarian here, and I'm hearing you talk about like how people just don't know. The library, which has been around for forever, people still don't get what library instruction is or what the reference librarians have to offer even. So if something that's been around that long and people still get it wrong, like, don't feel bad. I don't know. You know, we're kind of, it's an iterative process where you're like, actually, the library's more than books now, and you don't need to go to UVA to go get that journal because we can get it here, and it's on, you know, all those things. People think they know, but then you have to constantly come back to it, go, actually, you know what, it's changed since 30 years ago, or, you know, here's how we can actually help you.
Cool. Well, in the spirit of iteration and not going too far over time when there's wine in the next room, here are the upcoming events. Once again, you can save the date, write them down. We've got some flyers, right? There, and stickers. But I just want to highlight on a week from yesterday, so Tuesday the 20th, we have a design sprint led by Jess and Nigel about redesigning your discipline for the digital. And then we have the Future of Education as our next town hall right here on Tuesday, the 4th of October at 4 p.m.
Can we make a sentence about what that design sprint will be?
If one of them is not in a soundproof room right now.
I will do it. It's on the web. So if you go to the post on our website at umwdtlt.com called What is the Digital Liberal Arts, I've made these words clickable, so you can click the word design sprint and it will take you to the long description. The very short description is that Jess and Nigel are going to lead you in what we're calling an unworkshop, because it's less about them feeding your brains with stuff and much more about them facilitating a conversation. And so this is a conversation about some of the same topics, but that is much more focused on, let's see if we can reproduce your disciplines in light of how the digital has changed them. Did that, in a sentence, describe it? She's going to add.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a much longer blog post, but so basically this design sprint, what we really wanted to do is kind of break down some of the different characteristics of the different disciplines and how they're using digital tools to again address and to see whether or not there are commonalities and differences. And then we're hoping to actually have a tangible takeaway as well, which I'm not going to tell you. That's why you have to go. And I think it's going to be a really great resource and spark some good conversation, but also have some practical elements to it.
Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Feel free to partake of some
Rewind.
Good.
Did I see you at Eagle Nation Day this weekend?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, Hadley had a blast.
I thought I